In this video, let's learn about HTTP response status code. There are different status code. Specifically, we have 5 different categories. We have 100s, 200, 300, 400, 500. 100s is not very common, but it's for informational response. Okay, so 100 represents informational response. 200s represents successful responses. 300s represents redirectional responses, but 400s represent client if something is wrong from the client side. 500s represent server errors, so something is wrong from the server side. So let's take a look at 200s. We have actually covered 200 OK, and in the code we know that we're responding with 200 OK from get if everything is okay. So here in post we're responding with 201, which is created. 201 created. So it says the request has been fulfilled and new resource has been created on the server. So 201. And then put, we're responding with 204 is if everything is successful. And the description here says 204 no content. The server successfully processed request, but there's nothing to return, right? Although we are here returning something to the client just for demonstration purpose. And for delete, usually if everything is successful, we are returning 200. Okay, so because in this case, if we don't do anything, it returns 200, so we don't do anything. And then 400s, it's client error. So let's cover 400 first. And then we're going to go back and talk about 300s. So 400, the most famous one is for not found. So in our case, if we run our application, let's run it. You can see that we have this. And if we go to any URL, let's say, we haven't used this URL before, it just returns a blank page because we are using the run middleware. We're processing every single request. So this is not actually correct way to do it. Let's collapse everything. And what I want to do here is at the very end here of the if statement, if it doesn't fall into any of the previous branches, then over here, I want to give it 404, which stands for not found. So the resource on the server is not found, and this is the accurate status code. Now, if I run it and then I go to /000, now you can see the error page properly. It says this localhost page cannot be found. And other client errors, 400 bad request. So the server could not understand the request due to invalid syntax. For example, if we are processing the post method here and we can't actually deserialize it, or if after we deserialize this employee is null, then let's say that if the employee here is null, what are we going to do? We're going to say 400 because information provided by the client is invalid. And in this case, we can write some information if we want. If not, we can just return back. Okay, let's run this and let's go to add employee here. Let's say that if I remove this information and just click on send, then we got an exception. It says it doesn't contain any tokens. So we need to do a try catch. But before that, let's add a empty JSON here and click on send. It says employee added successfully. So apparently this check isn't working very well. We can add an if employee.id, at least we need to have an ID, right? So if employee.id is not end, but or if employee.id is less than 0, then we can return status code 400. So just some condition in order to see the status code. So again, go back over here and click on the send button. Now we see the bad request coming back. And of course, over here, we can do a try catch and move this, the curly braces, and then we can catch an exception. Inside here, we can again return a 400 response here. If we want, we can write some information back. Looks like we need to move this also into the try catch over here. And if we want to write information about exception over here like this, and let's run it again. Now let's go to Postman. Let's remove this. So this is going to trigger the same exception we have seen before and click on send button. Now we got the 400 BAT request and we got all of the stack from the exception object out, and we can see the information in the exception. That's 400. Then we have 401 unauthorized is right over here in the delete one, right? If we don't have this condition satisfied, we just spitting this out. But by spitting this out, we do see this error message in the page, but the status code is still 200. So that's incorrect. So for example, if I go over here and I send this request, and you can see that it says employee is deleted successfully. But if I change this from Frank to Frank1, now I'm going to change the ID to number 2 and click on send again. It says you are not authorized to delete, but the status code is incorrect. It is 200 okay. So what is supposed to happen is that we need to change status code. Status code to 401 before we write this response. And of course, we take the opportunity to fix this. So status code of not found should be 404. And this is 200, so we don't have to do anything. Okay, let's run the application again. Let's go to Postman and go to get. Let's make sure that we have 3 different employees over here. So John, Jane, and Sam. And let's go to delete. Still, we're specifying the wrong authorization key. And let's click on the send button. Now we see the same message, but we got the correct status code 401. So that's our 401 unauthorized. So we covered all of these 3 different things. Now let's talk about the 500. 500 means that the data that comes from the client, but something is wrong with the server side code. For example, there is a bug in our system. It should trigger 500. For example, by default, if there's any exception that is thrown in our code here, right here, it's going to cause a HTTP 500 error. In order to trigger that, let's just throw an exception no matter what. So let's say test exception. Let's bypass all of the code and let's click on run. Okay, so this is supposed to be triggered if we go to the employees location, right? Employees URL here. So let's go to employees. And you can see this proper error handling page, right? And if we go to the Postman here, get employees and click on send, we see 500 internal error. So the status code of 500 is automatically set if there is an exception, and it spits out the exception for you. And from here, ASP.NET Core has a default error page stack, and you can see that on line 28 we have this throw new exception, which is causing everything to crash. And we can go to the different ones to see what is the query string, what are the cookies, what are the headers. So this is the headers of the HTTP request and the routing, and this provides enough information for developers to troubleshoot. Of course, in production environment, we don't want to have this type of error page show up. We can customize that. We can talk about that later. So by default, if we don't do anything, ASP.NET Core already covers this exception handling thing. And why is that? How come ASP.NET Core can handle the exception and throw the HTTP 500? That's because here, although we only have this many lines of code, right? So everything ends here. This is our custom class. Everything ends here in our program.cs. So although everything is very simple, it looks like we only have one middleware. But as I mentioned before, this middleware pipeline is actually wrapped by the exception handling. So although we didn't specify the exception handling middleware, but it is right there in the pipeline. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the middleware pipeline in the next section. That covers our 500s. And let's now look at the 300s. So 300s is a redirectional message, redirectional status code. And let's take a look at some examples of, for example, 301 moved permanently. So the drawing software that I'm using right now is from a certain URL. So let's go to browser and let's try to use draw.io. So this draw.io is the URL that I always remember. But if I hit enter, notice that it's redirected to app.diagrams.net. And if I go to the developer tool by pressing on 12 and try to use the network tab to capture the traffic. Refresh button. Now, if I go up, so I cannot do this. Keep the network tab and then type in the URL. Hit enter. Now scroll all the way up here and you can see the first one is draw.io and the status code is 301. So click on this, go to headers and go to response header. Now look at this response header location. It points to app.diagrams.net. And then let's close this, go to the second one. The request URL is from app.diagrams.net. So this is the same as the location header. So what is actually happening right now? Well, draw.io is permanently discarded. And whenever you go to this draw.io, it moves you to app.diagrams.net. So in order to do this automatic redirect, when you go to draw.io, the server returns a 301 status code, and at the same time, it populates the location header. And when the browser receives this response, it sees, okay, so the status is 301, then it goes to the location header, finds the new URL, and automatically sends the second request that goes to the new URL. When this new URL is sent to the server, now it returns 200, okay. So this is moved permanently. So in the same way, 302 represents the resource is temporarily relocated at a different URL. So for example, if I go to this code here and go over here, so else if, so I'm going to test this, right, the path. And if this equals to /red, so redirection, then I'm going to say context.response.redirect. And I'm going to redirect to employees. So this will trigger 302. All right, so let's give it a try. Let's bring up our developer tool and let's refresh, not refreshing, but enter the path, the URL. So redirection, now it goes back to employees. And if we look at our network tab over here, the first one, redirection, the status code is 302. And let's go in here and look at our response headers. Location points to /employees. So in the same way, when the browser receives 302, it looks at the location header and then generates another request to the server. And that request goes to employees, the second one. So that's our 302 found. And 304 not modified means that there's some resources is cached on the browser. So it's not modified yet. Therefore, the browser is not go to the server to get the resource again. It just uses the cached copy. Okay, that covers all of our response status code. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.